Hello, thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Jaime Frankle, and I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. I am a high school teacher, and every year at the beginning of the year, we do orientation activities. And a common one is a game called Two Truths and a Lie. So I'm going to tell you three statements, two of which are true, one of which is false. Statement one, I am Jewish. Statement two, I'm vegan. Statement three, I'm a very good basketball player. Now, in person, when I'm standing up, you can see that I'm fairly tall, but even my students already know that I am not a good basketball player, so it's easy for them to spot the lie. But that's not the point of this. My point is my first statement, my first truth. I am Jewish. I am comfortable saying that to you because I have been lucky enough to grow up in a country where I felt comfortable being Jewish. I never felt like I had to hide that fact about myself. I never felt afraid to be Jewish. I was raised in a culture where that was an accepted identity. Unfortunately, my paternal grandparents, my father's parents, did not have that experience. They lived in Poland during World War II, and they only survived by hiding the fact that they were Jewish. So I am here today to tell you their story. My grandmother, Helene, was born in May 1923 in a small town in Kolo, Poland. These are her parents, David and Esther. David owned a flour mill. It was actually the family mill. Helene's grandfather had owned it before him. So they were fairly well off and well known in the town. She had an older sister, Swava, and often their parents would travel and Helene and Swava would be left with their full-time nanny. Life was very comfortable for them in Kolo. They went to school, they had lots of friends. Helene said that her older sister was perfect. So Helene, showed here, didn't necessarily feel like she wanted to try and live up to her sister in school, but she had friends, she was comfortable. Life was good before the war for my grandmother, Helene. My grandfather, Bernard, in the center of this picture, was born in April 1921 in Warsaw, Poland, so the big city. Here is his father, Moshe, and his mother, Dora, or Dorothy. Moshe owned a movie theater, and so the family was also fairly well off. Bernard was an only child until the age of 15, when his younger brother, Lolek, was born. And Bernard, shown here, was athletic. He had a very outgoing personality. He was very friendly. He liked to go to the movies and explore the city. So he also had a very comfortable life in Warsaw before World War II began. But then on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, starting the war. Helene said this was the first time that she felt like a Jew and not like a Pole, that she felt different and othered. In her small town of Kolo, everybody knew everyone. So everyone knew that this family, who the Jewish families were. Food was very scarce once the war started. So people had to wait in line to get food, and Jews were not allowed to wait in those lines. And her Polish neighbors were happy to point out to the police when Jews were in those lines when they weren't supposed to be. So it became dangerous to live in a town where people knew who you were. At one point, Helene's father, David, was arrested. He was beaten up, and then he was let go. And the family knew it was time to leave. So they moved to Warsaw. It's not that Warsaw was necessarily safer, but they'd have some anonymity there. No one would know that they were Jews. So the family moved to Warsaw, and in April of 1940, Helene and Bernard met. They lived in neighboring apartment buildings, and Helene's family had a piano. Bernard somehow found out there was a piano and a beautiful young girl in this apartment, so he came supposedly to look at the piano that he was thinking of buying, but we all know that he was really just there to flirt with Helene. So Helene and Bernard started going out, and at this point they could go out in the city. They looked more Polish than Jewish. according to the stereotypes. So they were able to go out into the city. Bernard, the big city boy, could show off to Helene, the small town girl. He'd take her to the movies and show her the sights. Things were almost normal for a little while. But then in October of 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was created. So all of the Jews of Warsaw had to move out of their apartments into this area in the city. It was about 1.3 square miles, and at one point it had almost 400,000 people living in it. Then in November of 1940, the ghetto was closed. So there were gates that were guarded by armed soldiers. There were high walls with barbed wire on the top. You could no longer get in or out. Helene and Bernard, because their families had to move when the ghetto was formed, now lived on opposite sides of the ghetto. So it became difficult for them to see each other. Here's my grandfather talking about his memories of the ghetto.
Hunger, 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 and hunger. Hunger by the young people, hunger by the old people, hunger by every number of any people who were before the war members of society suddenly couldn't find themselves. But the rest of the society was starving, slowly starving to death. When you went on the street, you saw kids between 9, 14, or 18 with bellies swollen, who could not move from this corner to the other corner, waiting for the money for a piece of bread or something. Those conditions were very bad, very inhuman. And when you have something like this, it hardens you because you see it daily, and you don't see any, and you just want to survive. You want to get away from this. And this is how we lived till 1943.
In July of 1942, what my grandmother called the actions began, where soldiers came and started rounding up residents of the ghetto and taking them to the train station and putting them on trains. At first, the Germans or the soldiers said, "Come with us, we'll take you somewhere better, there'll be more room, there'll be more food." But it quickly became apparent that this was a very dangerous thing to have happen to you, because the people who left never wrote, never came back, they were never heard from again. So it was dangerous to be in the ghetto if you didn't have a reason to stay. Bernard had a job in the ghetto. He was a cleaner. He would clean apartments and hospital rooms after people had been sick. So he had a work paper, which meant he could move around in the ghetto and he knew he wouldn't be deported. Helene's father, David, ran a flour mill in a factory in the ghetto, in the Tobin's factory. So he also had a work paper, which meant he was safe, he wouldn't be deported. But Helene and her mother and Bernard's mother and younger brother did not have these work papers. In July of 1942, when these actions began, the Germans were clearing the ghetto, trying to make it smaller. So the different colors on this map show as they were slowly moving the Jews into tighter and tighter quarters. And at one point, soldiers came to the building where Helene and her mother were living in August of 1942. Helene's mother, Esther, had MS, multiple sclerosis. She looked healthy, but she was not very mobile. It was very difficult for her to walk. So when the soldiers came to clear their building, she couldn't leave the apartment. So here is Helene telling us about the day that her mother was killed.
But my mother and I were in this house on Ogrodova, on the 4th floor, and the reason I'm telling you that, because there was a balcony. It was an August, most beautiful day, at least that's the way I remember. The sun was shining, and my mother and I were alone in this apartment. And then I kept hearing them coming, because from house to house they were going. And this probably was one of the scariest moments of my life. And they came to the yard, I wanted to say, but the downstairs at the building. And they stood at this area and they were screaming and calling everybody out and everybody out. And people were going down. And we didn't, because my mother couldn't walk. and I wasn't going to leave her. So we stayed, and hoping against hope that they will not come into that apartment. Well, after they get everybody down, then they were going from from apartment to apartment checking. And
Who
they
is
came.
they? They.
They were the Lithuanian soldiers. They were not Germans because they spoke no German. They came to our apartment. You see, many of the other people, like Lithuanian, Latvish, and Ukrainians, you know, they were helping, and they were doing a lot of wonderful work for them, and doing it with great pleasure. So those men came in. They were in uniform, and I was trying to explain to them in German, because I did learn German in high school, that my mother cannot walk. But, you know, she looked healthy. She sat there at the table. And they pulled me out of the room, and then I heard a shot, and they put me downstairs. And at that point, I really didn't care much. I knew she was shot. And they took us all in the group to the Umschlagplatz. We walked and walked and walked. When we got to the Umschlagplatz, which I am telling you is the train station, my cousin, whom I told you was this policeman, have watched this, all that, and he saw me there. And somehow he got me out. I don't remember, but we walked through some Polish areas, and he got me out.
At this point, Helene and her father moved to a new building deeper in the ghetto on Lesno Street across from the factory. And now it was even more dangerous to not have these work papers. So every day, Helene and all of the other residents of the building who didn't have work papers would hide in the cellar in the hopes that if the Germans came to, or the soldiers, whoever they were, came to clear the building, they wouldn't be found. At some point during this time, Helene and Bernard were married by proxy. It was still too dangerous for Helene to leave her building. So Bernard went out, he found a rabbi, he found 2 witnesses on the street, and he came back with a marriage license, and he spent the night. But Helene and Bernard's relationship was still relatively new, and things were very dangerous and uncertain, so neither of them was willing to leave their family. So they continued to live with their families on opposite sides of the ghetto. At some point, the deportations calmed down, and Helene was able to actually get married to Bernard in person in front of their families. On April 18th, 1943, Bernard crossed the ghetto to Helene and her father's apartment and invited them to spend the first night of Passover at his family's apartment. But Helene's father, David, was not comfortable leaving the building, so instead Bernard spent the night there. The next day, on April 19th, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began, and it became too dangerous, or impossible really, for Bernard to get back across the ghetto to his family. One of the people who Helene's father had worked with in the bakery had connections to the German underground. The German underground used the sewer system to smuggle flour and other supplies into the ghetto and to smuggle Jews out. So Helene, Bernard, and her father paid the Polish underground to smuggle them out of the sewers, coming out, we think, somewhere here in the Polish side of the city. Here's Helene talking about their trip through the sewers.
I tell you, those sewers of Warsaw were not those kind of sewers that you see in the movies here. They were, first of all, you had to go down and be on your all four, and it was a lot of water, and it was dark, and it was narrow, and the people who were leading us were Polish underground, I guess. They were the ones who was getting the money.
Were they
might have
Jews?
been, no, Poles. And there must have been maybe 20 of us. And we were walking in single file because of the fact that it was a very narrow and a lot of water. And I remember having in a bag a pair of shoes that I was holding, trying to keep, dry. And we were going in a very slow pace. And from the ghetto, from this Nowolipki that we were at, or Nowolipi, I don't know, to the area that the ghetto was ending, which I think was somewhere on Smocza. They have now the opening to the ghetto there, They have this opening that the sewer was coming out. They have some kind of a monument there in Warsaw. But anyway, it was quite a long distance. So we were walking, and we were walking on all fours, and at one point my father fainted. Bernard was in back of him, and I was in front of him. And when he fainted, Bernard held him, and it was very hard because the people had to pass by us. Now, Mr. Binder, this is the Jew friend of ours, came back and he said to me, look, I said, we're staying with with my father. He said, I promise you the people will come back for you. And I said, fine. So the three of us were sitting in that sewer, and till today there was another of those miracles, because no way did they have to come back. I mean, the money was given to them already. And you know, why would they come back for us? But anyway, we evidently hoped. The three of us were sitting in three different places. It was dark like hell. The rats were running around. And then we're hearing after a while up in the, on the street, cars and people walking and horses, The day started. This was at night.
Was there sewage in this water?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. And that's why there were rats. We're talking about the first day of Passover, which was either 18 or 19 of April. They were coming out through that sewer. Do you know, they came for us, which is a total miracle when I think of it. One of many, and they took us out. They brought for that this kind of like a sled, They used to bring that is how they used to bring flour to the mill, That's why the sewer was open, because that's how they knew it.
How long did you sit there?
I don't know, hours. To me, it sounded like all the time, but like a lifetime. But probably a couple of hours at least, because they had to go out and come back. As I tell you, that they came back, it was one of the greatest miracles of the year.
Once Helene and Bernard and David exited the sewers, they had to pretend to be Polish. They couldn't be known to be Jewish outside of the ghetto. So Helene and Bernard were able to get false papers that said they were Polish from an ex-boyfriend of Helene's. But her father, David, they're shown here together, was too afraid to live with false papers. So instead, he hid in an apartment owned by a woman named Martha with 3 other people. When Martha would go to work during the day, they had to be very quiet. They couldn't move, or if they did, they had to crawl on the floor. They couldn't be seen through the windows because they couldn't let anyone know there were people hiding in this apartment. Helene felt very guilty that she'd gotten her father out of the ghetto just to have him be living in constant fear. But they didn't have much choice. Here's Helene talking about going to visit her father during this time.
Now, when I was visiting my dad, I had to go on a streetcar, and I had to go around the ghetto, which was burning. And I must tell you that these people on the streetcar, some of them mother with little children, would say, look at the damn Jews, because of them, the ghetto our city is burning. I have not heard one word of sympathy. I tell you, it was the most incredible experience for me, because here I lived in a country that I always felt quite comfortable in. And yet it was, they hated us, and I never realized this. And I'm sure this is not true of everybody. It was just my experience.
At some point in May or June, Helene and Bernard were arrested in Warsaw by Polish police. They were able to get free by giving up their jewelry and their money, but the Polish police said if they were caught again, they would be turned over to the Germans. So they got new false papers that said they were Polish workers and transport papers to go to Vienna. It was very dangerous to even just get out of the train station onto the train. There were people there checking papers and looking for Jews and other victims of the Nazis who were trying to escape. But they managed to make it on the train in Warsaw and traveled to Vienna. In Vienna, they were given a job in a motor factory where they worked 55 hours a week. Because they worked so much, Helene and Bernard were given extra rations. They were paid for their work. They were given an apartment. So in some ways, life found a new kind of normal. They could travel. They could go out on picnics on the weekends. But at the same time, they were constantly afraid of being caught as Jews. They were especially afraid of the other Polish workers in Vienna who said they could smell out a Jew. So Helene and Bernard lived this way until April of 1945, when Vienna was liberated by the Soviet army. After the war, different organizations asked Jews to come and register to say that they were still alive. And it amazes me that these people who had spent years being targeted because of who they were came and proudly said they were Jews. This is how people started to discover who was left and what had happened to their families. So here's Bernard talking about what happened to the rest of his family.
My parents were the last message that I got through my cousin is that they went in Majdanek. They were up when the starting expulsion of the Jews from Warsaw Ghetto started. They started in July of 1942 and took them 6 months to clean out the ghetto. The remnants of the ghetto stayed till 1943, and then the uprising started. The Jews said, you kill us, but we are not moving. So the Germans had to put fire in every building in Warsaw and burn it out. And then the Jews, some would escape to the different bunkers, some would give up. Those who gave up were sent to Majdanek, and then they went to the oven. And I got people who survived, and they said my father and my brother were in Majdanek. And of course you knew that the young kids were first to die, and the grown-ups, so they were first to die.
This is the last picture Helene has of her immediate family. This is her mother, Esther, who was killed in the ghetto. Her father, David, was killed in July of 1943 in Warsaw. It's unclear when my grandmother knew what happened to her father, but he was killed shortly after they left for Vienna. In the middle is her older sister, Sława, and Sława's husband, Itzhak. They were married, and Sława went to go live with her husband in a small town called Horodenko in kind of this area of Poland. Itzhak was an agricultural engineer, and so one day in 1941, he was out in the fields when an Einsatzgruppen action happened. A group of German soldiers came, rounded up all the Jews in the village, and killed them all. So by the end of the war, Helene and Bernard both had lost their entire immediate families. It was a very strange time after the war. It was a little hard to believe it was over, that it was real at all. So they traveled around a bit. At one point, Helene went back to Kolo. She ran into a high school classmate who was thrilled that she had survived. But then she went to one of the men she knew in the village, basically, to ask about what had happened to her family's mill and maybe about getting it back. And the man said, "Our people don't get it, and you want to get it?" And Helene realized that she still wasn't one of our people. Much as they were happy to see her, she was still different. She was still an outsider to these people. So they realized there was really nothing left for them in Europe. So Helene and Bernard came to the United States on January 1st, 1947. Here's a picture of them on the ship on the way over. They landed in New York. Helene had some distant cousins in Kentucky, so they spent some time in Kentucky and eventually settled in Chicago. In Chicago, Bernard started a furniture store, and Helene went back to school. She became a social worker and worked for the Jewish Family Services. They had 3 sons, shown in the middle of this picture, and now 6 grandchildren. And they made sure their sons were raised Jewish and that their sons raised their grandchildren Jewish. It was not easy for them to be Jewish, but it was important that we knew we were Jewish and we knew what we had survived as a family. So they made sure we were raised to not be afraid to be Jews in this country. So here's what I'd like to ask of you today. Help create communities where people are not afraid to be who they are. Don't treat people as other or different or scary because they're different than you in any way. Help create a culture where people are able to be open about who they are without being afraid. Thank you very much for listening to my story. I'm now able to take some questions.
Thank you so much. Got a couple.
Okay.
First, when did your grandparents first kind of sharing their story, and when did you really start to hear that?
I don't have a specific memory of it. I think it was just kind of always around. Because their escape from the ghetto overlapped so closely with Passover, often parts of the story were told at the Seder every year. And so that, I think, is probably my first memory of hearing it.
Okay. Did they ever return to Europe? Have you been to Europe at all?
I have never been to Poland. My grandfather and my oldest uncle went to Poland in the 1980s, but none of the rest of the family has ever specifically made a trip to Poland.
What happened to Bernard's furniture store?
Bernard had a system of going out of business sales and then reopening the furniture store. It was a great way to drum up business. And so I think at some point he just had a going out of business sale and retired. But all of that was well before I was born and came into the picture.
It's a brilliant sales model.
Yes.
You have a lot of wonderful images. You have great video included. So where did you kind of get all of that?
Yes, good question. So the pictures mostly actually come from Helene's brother-in-law, Yitzhak, who was married to her sister. He survived because he wasn't in town the day the German soldiers came. And he actually survived by staying in the woods for almost 2 years. After the war, he moved to Canada and then to Israel. And Helene were very close because it was kind of all the family they both had left. He eventually remarried and had a son, and that's where the pictures came from. The video clips come from something called the USC Shoah Project, where after the film Schindler's List came out, there was a movement to start asking survivors to tell their stories. So my grandparents were both interviewed in 1996 for that project. And Helene had talked about it a lot more previous to that. She'd done some writing. So you can even tell just in these short clips, she was more comfortable talking about it, and her recall of details is unbelievable. My grandfather was never as comfortable talking about it, so he's a little less comfortable in these videos as well.
Great. When and why did you start sharing their story?
I actually first gave this presentation at my high school where I teach, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I just felt like it was important for high school students in particular to hear these stories. I was lucky enough to hear some of this from my grandparents firsthand and to have their own writing and these videos. So I felt like I wanted to be able to carry on their legacy of sharing their story.
Brilliant. The next one is, what was it like growing up as a grandchild of survivors?
I was the oldest grandchild. So I think some of it was just, I can't imagine how they felt when they had their own children and could kind of see their family continuing. But I think there was an even greater sense of relief once there was a second generation to carry on the family tradition that they were kind of all that they had left of. But I don't know that it felt any different than being the grandchild of any other Jewish grandparents.
And I have one last question, it looks like.
Okay.
You kind of already answered it, but what is kind of a message, takeaway, kind of, thing from hearing this story?
I mean, I think especially when I'm talking to a high school audience, I think they are aware of feeling othered. Every kid feels different, but I don't think they're always aware of how they make other people feel that way. But especially in the world right now, or this country right now, I think it's even more important to just remember we are all different, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And so making sure not to be afraid of other people or to make other people feel afraid.
Amazing. That is all the questions I have right now, so I will let
Okay.
you close this out.
Perfect. So thank you again for tuning in. Join us here next Wednesday, March 31st at 10 a.m. Central Time to hear second generation speaker Abby Romanek share her family story. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.